A piercing winter wind swept across the quiet outskirts of Marston, a small town tucked against the mountains of Colorado, when Anthony Brooks, one of the wealthiest tech entrepreneurs in the state, found himself stepping out of his car on a deserted roadside. He had only planned to clear his mind, to feel something other than the dull ache of loneliness that had clung to him since his father's passing. But the moment he heard the soft crunch of footsteps behind him and saw a tiny girl standing alone in the swirling snow, wearing a red coat far too thin for the storm, everything in his world shifted. Her cheeks were crimson from the cold, her small hands trembling as she held a worn wooden toy. And with eyes wide with desperation, she whispered the words that would change the course of his life, "Can you help my mom? If you believe in kindness, second chances, and the power of helping others when they need it most, please like this video, subscribe, comment, and share the story to support the channel. Your engagement truly helps more people discover these meaningful stories." Anthony froze. Not because of the cold, but because of the overwhelming sense of fear and urgency that poured out of the child. She couldn't have been older than 4. Her shoes were soaked, her bangs clinging to her forehead with melting snow. Everything about her presence was wrong, too young, too vulnerable, too alone in weather like this. As his heart pounded in his chest, something old and buried inside him stirred, the instinct to protect, to act, to not let another tragedy unfold. He bent down slowly, afraid to startle her. She pointed toward a small figure collapsed in the snow a few yards away. A woman. Motionless. Anthony didn't think, didn't weigh the risks, didn't tell himself someone else would handle it. He sprinted. The woman, likely in her early 30s, lay half buried in the growing snowfall, her arm curled slightly toward her child as though she had fought to stay conscious long enough to guide her to safety. Her other hand clutched a frayed fabric bag, the kind someone might throw together in a panic. Her breathing was faint, her lips blue. Anthony shook with adrenaline as he lifted her gently, calling out to the little girl to stay close. The snow intensified, biting into his skin, but he moved with unwavering determination, carrying the woman to his SUV and bundling the child beside her. The drive back into town felt endless. The woman shivered uncontrollably, drifting in and out of awareness, and every time she whispered her daughter's name, Mara, Anthony's grip tightened on the steering wheel. 1,000 questions swarmed his mind. How long had they been out here? Why were they alone? What had driven them into such danger? But the answers didn't matter yet. Survival did. At the hospital, nurses rushed to take the woman inside, and Anthony insisted on staying until he knew she was safe. Mara stayed with him, leaning into his coat, watching him with a trust that he felt he had not earned, but would deserve. Hours passed before a doctor approached and explained that the woman, whose name they discovered was Claire Donovan, had suffered severe hypothermia and exhaustion, likely from traveling long distances in the cold. She was stable, but her recovery would take time. Mara had no other relatives listed, no emergency contacts, and no resources. Anthony sat beside the child in the waiting room, offering her warm apple juice from a vending machine. She pressed her wooden toy into his hand, a small gesture of gratitude from a heart too young to understand magnitude but old enough to understand kindness. As he looked at her, he felt the strange sensation that the empty spaces in his life, spaces he had ignored for years, were slowly filling, thread by fragile thread. Over the next few days, Anthony stayed close. He visited Claire daily, learning bits and pieces about their story from doctors, social workers, and finally, from Claire herself once she recovered enough to speak softly through the haze of medication. Claire had fled an abusive partner in Nebraska after he had grown increasingly violent. She didn't have money for a bus or hotel. All she had was a friend's vague promise of safety in Colorado, and when that friend stopped answering her calls halfway through the journey, she was left stranded with a child and nowhere to go. She had tried walking to town after their old car broke down, but the storm hit faster and harder than she expected. She had been terrified, not for herself, but for Mara. Anthony listened in silence, feeling a fire ignite in his chest. He had spent years building companies, wealth, and influence, telling himself that his work mattered, that success was enough. But sitting beside Claire in that hospital room, he realized something painfully clear: he had never done a single thing with his fortune that truly saved someone who needed saving. Not until now. He offered help, not charity, not pity, but safety. A place to stay temporarily, warm meals, clothes, anything she needed while she rebuilt her life. Claire resisted at first, pride and fear battling in her tired eyes. But when she looked at Mara, holding Anthony's hand effortlessly as though she had known him forever, her voice trembled with surrender. She accepted. Anthony took them home to his lakeside property, a space that until recently had felt far too large and far too quiet. Mara's laughter filled the rooms like sunlight cracking open a darkened sky. Claire moved gently, gratefully, but with caution, as though afraid the world might take away this fragile moment of peace. Anthony never asked questions that might dig into wounds that needed time to heal. He simply offered presence, rides to the clinic, fresh groceries, space to breathe, silence when she needed it, reassurance when she didn't. As weeks passed, the snow melted, and winter softened its grip on the Colorado mountains. Claire found small freelance work, slowly regaining confidence. Mara developed a fondness for following Anthony around the property, helping him feed birds or fix imaginary problems in his workshop. The loneliness Anthony had lived with for so long dissolved in the quiet moments, like the mornings he found Claire reading by the window, or the afternoons Mara tugged on his sleeve, asking him to braid her hair terribly, or the evenings when all three shared cocoa on the porch, wrapped in blankets as the sky erupted in sunset colors. But healing was not linear. Claire still startled at loud noises. She still woke up from nightmares, breathing hard, gripping her sheets as though she were bracing for harm. Anthony learned to listen, to give her space, to show through actions, not promises, that she was safe here. That Mara was safe. That they were not alone. One evening, long after Mara had fallen asleep with her toy tucked under her arm, Claire approached Anthony in the living room. Snowflakes drifted lazily outside, but inside, the fire cast warm light across her gentle features. She admitted the truth she had carried since the hospital: she had been terrified of him at first, terrified of trusting, terrified of accepting help, terrified of what he might expect in return. But over time, she realized that Anthony's kindness came with no conditions. That his heart was genuine. That he was, in many ways, as wounded and searching as she was. Anthony felt something shift inside him as she spoke, something like hope, like belonging. But he stayed silent, letting her speak at her own pace. Her voice trembled when she said he had saved her and Mara, not just from the snow, but from a future without safety or compassion. Months passed. Spring bloomed. And slowly, a bond formed, one not forged by desperation, but by understanding, shared healing, and the quiet, steady resurgence of trust. Anthony found himself looking forward to mornings because of Claire's soft smile, to evenings because Mara's laughter echoed through the halls, to the future because, for the first time, it felt like it could be filled with family, warmth, and purpose. A year after the day he found them in the snow, Anthony stood with both of them on the very road where it all began. Not in grief, but in gratitude. Claire held his arm, her eyes warm with unspoken affection. Mara held his hand, swinging it playfully as she hummed. Snowflakes drifted gently again, but this time, none of them felt the cold. If this story touched your heart, please like, subscribe, comment, and share. Your engagement helps us continue creating meaningful stories that inspire and uplift. Before the ending, please comment below, what part of the story moved you the most? In that quiet moment, surrounded by the softness of winter and the warmth of new beginnings, Anthony realized something profound: that sometimes, God places the people we need most in front of us in the most unexpected circumstances. And that saving someone else can often be the very thing that saves us in return.